The heavy clang of iron collars echoed through the damp chambers beneath the auction hall, a sound that resonated deep within the stone. She was traded away for nothing more than a single tarnished copper piece. No distinctive aroma trailed behind her. No vibrant hues graced her fur. No allegiances bound her to any lineage, and no true title was spoken aloud. To the gathering crowds, she was merely the most unsightly creature within the borders of the Seven Realms. An unfortunate mistake of nature, dragged onto a platform to be mocked. Yet the laughter found no home in one specific chest. The supreme ruler of the 7 territories, the ultimate Alpha King, whose very name caused seasoned warriors to falter, arose from his high seat. Without a word, he reached beneath his heavy furs, withdrawing an artifact that caused every heartbeat in the massive arena to seize simultaneously. It was a radiant golden moonstone, a treasure whose raw worth surpassed the combined wealth of 100 sovereign packs. He placed it down for her. No soul present could comprehend the logic behind the transaction, least of all the fragile creature standing beneath the torchlight. But what emerged from the heavy silence when her tattered mantle finally slipped from her shoulders would soon dismantle every ancient decree. Every pure bloodline, and every foundational deception upon which the empire had been constructed. Her transformation was not a mere shift of flesh. It was a violent recalibration of reality itself. This is the chronicle of Nyx, the wolf they attempted to erase, the sovereign they failed to recognize, and the proud ruler who was brought to his knees long before a crown was ever placed upon her brow. Chapter 1. Within the vast boundaries of the kingdom of Lunara, existence was defined strictly by the essence of one's birth. True value was never determined by the accumulation of coin or the legacy of a family name, but rather by the primal scent carried within the blood. A wolf could endure the deepest poverty, carry the jagged scars of 100 defeats, or bear the exhaustion of 10 consecutive lifetimes across their spine. Yet, if their coat ignited like burning amber under the full moon, or ran as midnight black as a storm-driven sea, society would bend to their presence. Elaborate gates swung open without resistance, proud gazes lowered in submission, and entire domains waged devastating wars simply to claim a lineage that exuded the rich scent of crushed cedar and fertile winter earth. But if the ancestral scent was absent, or worse, if a wolf carried no fragrance at all, the world offered no sanctuary. No leniency was written into the ancient laws carved upon the stone pillars of the realm. To exist without a scent was to be a phantom traversing the realm of the living. And those who thrived took great care to ensure the outcasts never forgot their isolation. Nyx understood this truth with absolute clarity. She had carried this awareness since her 9th year. The precise winter afternoon when a prominent pack elder had pressed his snout against her hair, only to recoil with a snarl as if his flesh had touched a searing iron. Nothing, the old wolf had announced, his voice carrying across the frozen courtyard. There is absolutely nothing here. He had not lowered his voice to spare her feelings. He had spoken the words with the flat indifference one reserves for describing the morning fog or the arrival of winter frost, without an ounce of remorse, because undeniable facts required no apologies. Her coat was the dull color of winter ash, completely devoid of the shimmering silver that inspired mythic poetry in the northern texts, and entirely lacking the pale frost white that the polar factions revered in their spiritual healers. It was simply gray, the precise shade of decayed timber or abandoned structures left to rot in the wilderness, the hue of things entirely forgotten by time. Her life unfolded on the forgotten fringes of the Ashvin Pack territory, an unforgiving landscape where the soil remained perpetually sodden, regardless of the season, and the ancient trees leaned away from the central village as if deeply mortified by the community's desperate existence. The Ashvin people occupied the lowest tier of the social hierarchy within Lunara. 7 magnificent packs held supreme dominion above them, and within the desperate borders of the Ashvin territory, Nyx existed beneath the lowest servant. She refused to squander her limited strength on bitterness or resentment. The daily struggle for survival demanded too much attention to permit the luxury of anger. Her younger brother, Fen, was barely 12 winters old, his frame still thin and awkward as he grew into his bones. And his nights were frequently shattered by terrifying night terrors he would never openly acknowledge. Her younger sister, Lyra, was 9 years old and possessed a mind as sharp as a flint splinter. A child composed entirely of endless questions and lean elbows, harboring the kind of vivid intelligence that required constant intellectual nourishment. Their biological parents had vanished into the wilderness 4 winters past, leaving behind no physical remains, no identifiable scent trail, and no explanation that the ruling elders were willing to share. Though Nyx had confronted every single leader, watching their eyes slide away with the cold indifference of water running over river stones. Eventually, she ceased asking questions. She dedicated herself to the art of survival instead. On the gray morning that Crow delivered the decree regarding the Imperial auction, Nyx was crouched low over a sputtering fire pit outside their dilapidated cabin, carefully turning thin strips of preserved rabbit across a rusted iron grate. The heavy wood smoke rose in a straight, uninterrupted line toward the canopy, completely undisturbed by the wind. And the atmosphere carried the distinct aroma of wet pine needles and the sharp electricity of an approaching thunderstorm. Crow halted at the perimeter of her cleared campsite, refusing to offer the common courtesy of sitting. The great lunar auction convenes in 3 days, the elder stated, his voice flat and unyielding. Your name has been officially inscribed upon the ledger. Nyx adjusted the meat on the iron rack, keeping her blind, clouded eyes directed toward the warmth of the embers, her movements deliberate. I was never consulted on this matter. You were never going to be, Crow replied, the words dropping between them like stones. The reality was laid bare, pristine, and devoid of emotion. Nyx straightened her spine with slow, measured grace and turned her face toward him. Observing this weathered wolf with his mud-splattered coat and his small, calculating eyes, she recognized instantly that no degree of righteous fury would alter her circumstances. What is the exact allocation of compensation for the family? She inquired quietly. The elder recited a meager sum. It was far from a fortune, but it was sufficient. It was enough to guarantee that Fen and Lyra would have grain during the freezing months when the snow blocked the mountain passes. It was enough to secure the thatch needed to repair the leaking roof before the autumn downpours intensified. It was enough to alter the course of their immediate survival. Crow departed without a concluding remark or a gesture of farewell. He was not deliberately malevolent in his actions. He simply did not perceive her as a living being that merited gentleness or consideration. Nyx returned to her position beside the hearth. For a protracted interval, she watched the orange flames consume the dry wood, observing how the heat instinctively sought out the structural flaws, the decayed centers, and the fragile sections where the bark had already detached from the meat of the branch. The element of fire possessed a dangerous form of intelligence. It never expended energy where it was not required. "I can endure this," she whispered to the empty air. "I have survived far worse." On the dawn of the scheduled auction, she awoke long before the sun broke the horizon. Sitting in absolute stillness beside her sleeping siblings within the dim light. Fen lay with his jaw slightly slack, his breathing rhythmic. Lyra had managed to claim both of their heavy wool blankets during the night, wrapping herself so thoroughly that only a small fan of dark hair remained visible at the crown of the bundle. Nyx chose not to disturb their rest. She placed several pieces of dried venison and the remainder of the hearth bread upon the wooden table, using a piece of charcoal to etch a simple message onto a fragment of birch bark: "Returning soon." She did this because Lyra had only recently mastered her letters and found immense joy in discovering written words left behind for her. Stepping out into the biting morning air, Nyx pulled the heavy mantle around her shoulders before she crossed the boundary of the trees. The garment was a massive, unwieldy piece of architecture, crafted from a coarse brown wool that had once belonged to her mother, now retaining only the distinct smells of old wood smoke, damp earth, and decades of passage. The fabric had been mended so frequently that the original pattern was more of a legend than an actual textile. She pulled the deep hood low over her face, telling herself the gesture was merely a defense against the rising wind. She commenced the long journey toward the great market hall, situated 7 miles to the east, where the aristocrats of the kingdom gathered to appraise and purchase unmated wolves like livestock at a seasonal fair. It was a place where influential factions bid heavily on bodies that possessed the ideal scent profiles, the perfect coat textures, and the necessary spiritual auras to reinforce their bloodlines or manage their grand estates. She walked because no alternative existed in her world. She walked because 2 young children remained in a cold cabin, relying entirely on her capacity to endure. She moved forward with her chin tilted upward, not out of open defiance and not out of stubborn vanity, but out of something far more resilient than both: the simple, absolute reality of her own persistence. The sun was nothing more than a pale promise on the edge of the world when she finally reached the main stone highway. The massive iron braziers surrounding the auction pavilion were already ablaze, casting a harsh golden glare against the overcast sky. The structure was visible from miles away, manifesting the prominent manner in which raw power always announces its presence. She did not decelerate her pace. She did not avert her gaze. She advanced directly toward the light, a scentless, unrevealed presence to every soul gathering within those stone walls. completely unaware that by the hour of her departure, the entire structure of the kingdom would be irrevocably altered. She carried only the memory of the children who required sustenance. That single truth was enough to carry her across the threshold. Chapter 2. The Hall of Moons did not resemble a standard piece of architecture. It possessed the atmosphere of a collective, suspended breath. The massive stone walls soared 40 feet into the air, curving inward at the summit to replicate the interior of a giant rib cage. Illuminated by 100 oil vessels secured within iron brackets fashioned like crescent moons. The expansive ceiling was painted the profound midnight blue of a midwinter sky, meticulously inlaid with thousands of polished white stones that formed the shapes of ancient constellations. The spirits of the founding alphas, according to historical lore, watching from above to ensure equitable commerce among the packs. On this particular evening, those ancient stars bore witness to an immense gathering. The great hall was suffocatingly crowded. Prominent alphas occupied long tables crafted from dark oak. Their personal guards and advisors arranged behind them like heavy cloaks formed of living men. Pack lords, adorned in luxurious fur collars, drank deep from chalices of polished silver. Merchants and minor nobility pressed tightly against the perimeter walls, straining their necks to catch a glimpse of the stage, mentally cataloging the value of every offering. The air was thick and heavy with overlapping scent markers, the rich aroma of cedarwood, the sweetness of amber, and the heavy musk of dominant bloodlines. And beneath the sensory assault lay something far more sinister, the sharp scent of political ambition and desperate hunger. It was the distinct odor of individuals determining the exact price of other living souls. Nyx stood within the narrow holding corridor directly behind the main presentation stage. Her ears captured every sound from the arena. She listened intently to the frantic bidding occurring for the wolf positioned ahead of her in the ledger. He was a young subordinate from the prestigious Crestfall pack, possessing a coat that resembled warm summer honey and a scent profile that the master of ceremonies described as a harvest field after the initial winter frost. The audience had responded passionately to that description. The financial figures escalated with terrifying speed. The heavy wooden gavel descended on an amount that could have comfortably sustained the entire Ashvin population for 3 consecutive winters. A wave of thunderous applause followed, the sound of societal validation, granted as easily as intake of breath. Then her designated identification number was called across the microphone. She moved forward, simply because her limbs obeyed the mechanical command. Her consciousness had retreated to a remote, serene chamber within her mind. A defensive mechanism she employed whenever the reality before her grew too massive to confront directly. She focused her thoughts on the small piece of birch bark resting on her kitchen table. She envisioned the rhythmic rise and fall of Finn's chest in the shadows of the cabin. She stepped through the heavy velvet curtain and advanced into the blinding glare of the torches. The noise within the hall did not cease instantly. Instead, it underwent a sickening transformation. It curdled. Initial whispers emerged, urgent and sharp. The specific sound an audience produces when an entirely unexpected variable introduces itself to the stage. Then, a sharp laugh erupted from a table positioned to the left, low, cruel, and dripping with satisfaction, the type of amusement that stems not from surprise, but from the validation of a cruel expectation.
Additional voices joined the chorus, the mockery spreading outward from that solitary point, like ripples disrupting the surface of stagnant water.
Nyx maintained her focus on an imaginary point in the middle distance, an unchanging coordinate situated well above the mocking faces of the crowd, just beneath the painted stars of the ceiling. The auctioneer, a portly man adorned in a traditional ceremonial sash, who possessed an inflated sense of his own position, leaned toward her form. She felt the sudden, involuntary twitch of his nostrils as he attempted to discern her essence. She noted the brief contraction at the edge of his mouth before he smoothed his features and turned back to address the assembly. He cleared his throat, the sound amplified by the acoustics of the stone walls. "We present for your consideration," a brief pause, a mere catching of breath, yet long enough to emphasize the insult, Lot 47. A female, unbonded, originating from the Ashvin territory. No poetic description of her coat was offered to the buyers, and no mention of a scent profile was made. There were only the bare, unadorned statistics, stripped of any language that might inspire interest or value. The opening registration requires a single copper coin. The restrained amusement of the room erupted into open, unrestricted laughter. It was not the muffled tittering of polite society, but a raw, collective roar, heads tilting backward, shoulders shaking violently, the sound of an entire assembly deciding simultaneously that her existence was the ultimate jest of the season. Someone seated near the prestigious central tables shouted an insult that triggered an even greater wave of hilarity. Nyx did not process the specific words. She had ceased translating human speech, focusing exclusively on the mechanical movement of her lungs. Inhale, exhale, inhale. Her fingers were trembling violently beneath the folds of her mother's brown mantle. She pressed her palms flat against the rough fabric of her trousers, forcing her muscles to lock. Her jaw remained perfectly rigid. From the rear right section of the pavilion, lounging with the effortless arrogance of a man who owned the very timber beneath him, Lord Vane tilted his sharp head. He was a nobleman of sharp features and a silver tongue, celebrated across 6 provinces for his ruthless diplomatic maneuvers, and notorious in the 7th for the devastation that inevitably followed his agreements. His eyes carried the exact hue of oxidized metal coins, possessing an equivalent degree of warmth. He reached into the breast pocket of his tailored coat, retrieved a solitary, tarnished copper piece, and flipped it with 2 fingers toward the central presentation desk. The coin spun twice upon the polished timber before settling with a hollow click. "I will assume ownership of the Phantom," Vane announced, his voice cutting through the din. The assembly erupted anew. Nyx experienced the sheer volume of the sound as a physical weight pressing against her ribs. She maintained her blind gaze on that solitary point in the upper atmosphere, above the sea of faces, beneath the stone constellations. Her hands continued to shudder against her thighs. "This is merely a moment in time," she reminded herself silently. "This sequence will conclude. This does not represent the entirety of your existence. Lyra's note remains on the table. Focus on your breath." And then the world went entirely silent. It was not the gradual dissipation of noise, but an instantaneous, The absolute void that occurs only when an impossible event manifests before an audience that believed it understood the absolute laws of reality. The sound of a heavy wooden chair scraping against stone echoed through the space. The wood was dense, the floor unforgiving. The sharp noise sliced through the residual murmurs like a forged blade. And the collective laughter of the aristocracy collapsed mid-breath as every head turned toward the source. At the royal pavilion, positioned entirely apart from the secondary nobility and elevated upon a stone dais at the true center of the hall, King Valerius stood. He had not uttered a single word throughout the long evening. He had sat with the absolute immobility of a mountain crag, watching the human transactions pass before him like fleeting weather. Unignorable, terrifying, and completely detached from the common populace. He did not resemble the romantic descriptions found in the village lore. The legends used the word feared. What Nyx perceived, even without the benefit of sight, was an energy far older than mere terror. It was a dense structural weight, the kind of presence that physically alters the density of the air in a room. He did not offer a glance to the surrounding crowd. He did not look in the direction of Lord Vane. He reached into his heavy winter mantle with a slow, deliberate motion. The mannerism of an individual who possessed such absolute authority that time itself was obligated to accommodate his pace. And he placed an object upon the bidding table. The physical sound of the impact was minimal, a soft, an intentional click against the wood, but the immediate golden luminescence it discharged was blinding. It was an ancient, irreplaceable moonstone, an artifact of power that glowed with an internal fire. It was worth more than 100 territorial packs combined. A treasure that the vast majority of individuals in the room would never behold across 10 lifetimes. It rested upon the timber, pulsing with a light that suggested it had consumed the moon itself and retained the celestial fire within its core. The mockery vanished from the hall, every single trace of it dissolving as if it had never existed. No one dared to draw a full breath. Valerius raised his eyes. For the first moment since the commencement of the auction, he directed his gaze toward the platform. He looked directly at Nyx. She found herself facing his direction. She could not identify the exact moment she had abandoned her focus on the middle distance to turn toward his presence. Only that an undeniable force had pulled her attention, and that his eyes were dark, still, and completely unreadable. He was observing her form in a manner she had never experienced from another living soul. He was not looking through her presence, nor was he looking past her shoulder. He was looking directly at her. When his voice finally resonated through the stone chamber, it was low, unhurried, and carried the texture of old stone. He uttered 2 words. That was all. "She is mine." The ensuing silence was a living, breathing entity. And within that void, Nyx's scentless, hidden hands pressed against her trousers felt an undeniable shift in the fundamental fabric of the moment. She possessed no vocabulary for the sensation, but she recognized that the world had just changed its collective mind about her worth. And in that same quiet space, without seeking permission from anyone, so had she. Chapter 3. The mountain fortress possessed no title that the common folk used more than once in conversation.
In the ancient territorial ledgers, it was officially recorded as Varenhold. The High Court referred to it simply as the Stronghold. The agrarian packs residing in the fertile valleys below designated it as the Gray Place, or merely up there, spoken with a specific drop of the jaw that indicated a destination where one would never willingly travel and had no desire to contemplate. Nyx arrived at the perimeter gates as dusk settled over the peaks. The mountain paths had consumed the main highway over an hour prior, replacing the smooth road with a treacherous trail carved directly from the living rock. Wide enough for only 2 horses to walk abreast, and bordered by nothing but vertical stone drop-offs and the occasional iron torch basket. The heavy wooden carriage into which she had been placed without a single word of explanation by 2 royal guards. Men who were neither cruel nor kind, but functioned merely as extensions of the state, had rattled and climbed against the incline for the better part of the day. When the silhouette of Varenhold finally materialized through the mist, it appeared all at once, without warning. A sharp turn around a blind precipice revealed the structure, cut directly into the face of the mountain, like an entity that the stone had harbored since the dawn of creation and had only recently conceded to display. Its massive towers did not point toward the sky so much as they continued upward from the bedrock, an inseparable extension of the mountain from which they were formed. The walls carried the specific hue of weathered iron. The narrow window slits resembled guarded eyes, illuminated from within by a cold amber light. The structure possessed no conventional beauty. It manifested an architecture that was far more serious than beauty. Nyx stepped down from the carriage transport and faced the massive facade for a long, silent interval. Then, securing her small bundle of worldly possessions against her ribs, she walked through the yawning iron gateway. She had mentally prepared herself for the realities of a subterranean dungeon or a confinement cell adjacent to one, a cramped, moisture-laden space with a heavy iron bolt on the exterior door and the suffocating silence of a location where individuals are stored rather than preserved. Instead, the master of the household, a lean, meticulously dressed official named Aldrich, who moved with the frantic energy of someone perpetually trailing behind a more critical engagement, conducted her to a spacious chamber situated on the eastern face of the fortress. The room was positioned on the 3rd tier of the structure, featuring a deep-set window that overlooked the vast valley below and a grand stone hearth where a substantial fire had already been kindled. The bed was dressed in crisp, clean linens. A ceramic pitcher of mountain water rested upon the table, still radiating heat from the kitchen fires. A neatly folded ensemble of garments, crafted from a sturdy, dark gray wool that was both plain and practical, sat atop the wooden chest at the foot of the bed. Aldrich remained standing within the stone doorway, delivering his mandates with the robotic cadence of a clerk reading from a legal document he had neither authored nor desired to modify. You will not initiate contact with the king. You will ask no questions of the staff. You will under no circumstances remove your mantle in the presence of others. Without waiting for an acknowledgement, he turned on his heel and departed. Nyx remained standing at the center of the chamber for a long moment. She tested the structural integrity of the floor with her heel, solid, unyielding stone that offered no vibration. She examined the iron latch of the window. Finally, She sat upon the edge of the mattress, pressing her palms flat against the clean fabric, and drew a deep, steady breath. It was clean, quiet, and capable of being secured from the inside. She had occupied far more dangerous environments in her quest to survive. She would decipher the rules of this house in due time. She did not encounter the Sovereign for 3 consecutive days. She was aware of his presence, however. Occasionally, the heavy thud of footsteps would echo through the corridor before the arrival of dawn. There was the distinct sound of a massive oak door closing with the absolute finality characteristic of an individual who had concluded a silent debate with their own thoughts. Once, while traversing the perimeter of the grand hall during an off-hour, she caught a fleeting glimpse through the open archway. She perceived a massive back, a dark mantle of heavy wool, and a man standing completely motionless before the western window, staring out into the empty mist. She did not linger. She continued her walk. She had alternative details to analyze. The fortress was immense and bore the faint signs of systemic neglect common to large, arrogant structures. A deterioration born not from financial ruin, but from a prideful refusal to acknowledge that routine maintenance is a fundamental expression of stewardship. The primary supply vaults were organized by an individual who had long since abandoned any interest in whether the inventory matched the records. The domestic staff moved around one another with the guarded tension typical of individuals who had existed without clear leadership for an extended duration, filling the organizational void with petty grievances and territorial rivalries. On her initial day, Nyx reorganized the entire dry storage vault. She did not perform this task because an official had commanded it. She initiated the project because the existing arrangement defied logical structure, and having entered the space in search of a replacement candle, she found herself rectifying the chaos before she made the conscious decision to involve herself. On the second afternoon, a romantic werewolf tale, she quietly resolved a bitter dispute between 2 primary kitchen servants that had apparently disrupted the household for months and had recently begun to compromise the quality of the morning meals. She did not introduce herself with a grand title or explain her position within the castle hierarchy. She simply sat at the wooden preparation table with both individuals and requested that each describe the root of the conflict as though the other party were not present in the room. By the time both had articulated their frustrations, the practical resolution was apparent to all involved, including the disputants themselves. On the 3rd day, she crossed paths with the king, or rather, she discovered the vulnerability that the sovereign had been actively concealing from the eyes of his court. She had made an incorrect turn within the labyrinthine corridors of the East Wing, tracking a thin sliver of light that escaped from beneath a heavy wooden door. The space turned out to be a private study. He was seated at the desk, his formal mantle removed, his left sleeve rolled tightly to the elbow. The laceration across his forearm was old but angry, a combat wound that had closed incorrectly and subsequently ruptured along the margin. The precise consequence of prioritizing warrior pride over medical sense. He raised his head the instant she crossed the threshold. She offered no apology for the intrusion. She evaluated the status of the injury with the same clinical directness she applied to every problem in her environment. That requires an immediate, medicated poultice, she stated, her voice calm. The tissue along the margin is pulling apart under the tension. A heavy silence settled over the room, a stillness that possessed sharp edges. "I did not request your assistance," Valerius responded.
"No," she concurred, her movements steady as she turned to gather the necessary medical supplies, regardless of his words. She returned to his side moments later. He had not altered his position. She interpreted his immobility as tacit consent and proceeded to cleanse and dress the laceration with practiced hand movements. Devoid of unnecessary ceremony, he monitored her every gesture throughout the process, his countenance displaying an expression she could neither interpret nor felt compelled to decipher. She departed the study without asking why she had been brought to his mountain. She suspected the truth was beginning to manifest. Within the deep shadows of his own stronghold, Valerius watched her retreat. He believed he had purchased a non-entity, a creature devoid of a scent profile, lacking any allegiance to a rival pack, and possessing no ambitious family that could utilize her position to leverage influence against his throne. He had intentionally calculated a strategy based on absolute invisibility. He had not anticipated this development. He had not prepared for the quiet, devastating competence of her presence. He noted the systematic manner in which she navigated his fortress, as if she were mentally cataloging its architecture, not searching for strategic vulnerabilities, but identifying its systemic needs, moving through a neglected environment, and simply, without theatrical display, beginning to care for its health. He was entirely uncertain how to classify that behavior. He was still contemplating the dilemma when Aldrich materialized within his doorway, holding a sealed parchment. The document bore no aristocratic crest, and no courier's identity was recorded on the ledger. The sealing wax was the deep, disturbing crimson of arterial blood. Inside were 3 concise sentences. He read the words a single time. It was Vane's distinct script, executed with Vane's mechanical precision. "You have confiscated property that belonged to my estate. That action represents a profound error in judgment, Your Majesty. I shall soon confiscate something that belongs to yours." Valerius folded the parchment with deliberate care, placed it upon the dark wood of his desk, and directed his gaze toward the empty doorway where Nyx had stood moments before, a space she had somehow filled completely despite her slender frame. He felt a cold current move through his chest that had nothing to do with the winter wind howling against the mountain peaks. He had believed he purchased a phantom, and someone had just discovered she was alive. Chapter 4. The phenomenon initiated with the regular night guard rotation. Sergeant Wren was not an individual burdened by an overactive imagination. He had executed his duties within the Varenhold guard structure for 11 consecutive years, traversing those identical stone corridors under every conceivable variation of darkness and cold. And he had long since achieved a state of peace with the absolute monotony of a fortress that refused to alter its shape. Stone remained stone, and shadow remained shadow. He possessed the training to distinguish between the two. Therefore, when he witnessed the manifestation at the terminal end of the eastern corridor on the 14th evening following Nyx's arrival, he terminated his forward progress and stood perfectly still. He acted with the absolute immobility that veteran soldiers employ when their survival instincts ignite before their analytical mind can process the data. It was a wolf. It was magnificent in its proportions. The creature was larger than any canine form he had encountered across 3 decades of military service to the packs.
It surpassed the dimensions of the king's shifted form, which had previously represented the largest physical manifestation Ren had ever witnessed with his own eyes. The entity stood at the distant convergence of the corridor, where the stone passage curved toward the spiral tower stairs. And its physical body was... There was no alternative vocabulary available to his memory. Luminous. It was as white as freshly fallen snow on a high peak, as brilliant as the core of a raging furnace, radiating a faint, silver-gold luminescence that cast no corresponding shadows on the wall and produced no audible sound against the floor. The creature turned its massive head. Ren could not discern the color or structure of its eyes at that distance. He would find himself unable to articulate during subsequent interrogations whether the emotion that gripped his chest in that moment was conventional fear. It was an experience far older than terror, a sensation that resided in the primitive layers of consciousness beneath language. Then the entity glided around the stone corner, its movement smooth and utterly silent, and Ren ran. When he reached the intersection, the long corridor was entirely vacant. No paw prints disrupted the dust on the stone floor. No residual heat lingered in the air. No trace of a scent profile remained behind. Nothing but the customary scent of cold iron and damp mountain rock. He remained at the spot for a protracted interval, attempting to steady his breathing. Then he proceeded directly to the quarters of his commanding officer. By the arrival of morning light, the 4 additional patrol wolves had submitted independent reports describing the identical sighting on separate evenings. Each warrior had hesitated to come forward initially, fearing ridicule. The individual accounts were identical in every structural detail. They could not have coordinated their stories. The massive dimensions, the absolute absence of sound, the light that refused to generate shadows, and the distinct impression of being evaluated by an entity that recognized more elements within your soul than you were comfortable acknowledging. Aldrich delivered the compiled documents to Valerius, who analyzed the text without a single change in his expression before issuing a brief command. Summon the archivist. Elder Moss entered the grand hall looking like an individual who had occupied old age for so long he had entirely forgotten the concept of youth. He functioned as the fortress's primary keeper of bloodline registers, territorial charters, and the sealed accounts of historical events that the kingdom had elected to remember in absolute silence rather than public celebration. Aldrich read the patrol accounts aloud. Moss listened with his eyelids half closed, his gnarled hands resting atop his wooden walking staff. He offered no interruptions or clarifying inquiries. When the master of the household finished the final report, the ancient historian remained motionless for a considerable duration. Finally, he spoke. Which specific wing of the archive level? The eastern corridor, the 3rd tier, in the vicinity of the... Yes, Moss interrupted softly, his voice a dry whisper. Yes. He did not volunteer what the affirmation signified to his analytical mind. That identical evening, Aldrich's informant, positioned within the lower archive levels, reported that Elder Moss had descended into the subterranean vault, the highly restricted section that required 2 separate keys and a witness verification signature that Moss had simply forged without assistance. The midnight hour brought a deep, suffocating stillness to the mountain fortress of Varenhold. High above the jagged peaks, the winter wind moaned against the ancient iron-colored stone walls like a dying beast, its low-frequency vibration vibrating through the floorboards. Inside the restricted archives, the shadows stretched long and thin, illuminated only by the dying embers of a nearby hearth. The ancient historian had left his chambers locked, but the iron bolt was no match for the precise, practiced touch of the Alpha King. Valerius stepped into the cramped room without making a single sound, his heavy leather cloak sweeping silently across the dusty floor. He did not summon his guards, nor did he light a torch. A ruler who commanded 7 vast territories had no need for permission to inspect his own archives. Yet he chose the darkness because he required absolute solitude to digest the secrets hidden within. In the corner of the room, the old archivist lay beneath heavy, threadbare blankets, his breathing deep and rhythmic, locked in the profound sleep of the elderly. Valerius ignored the sleeping form. His coin-sharp eyes scanned the cluttered desk, immediately landing on the object of his search. It was a massive, ancient ledger, bound in cracked black leather, completely devoid of any title or emblem on its cover. The old scholar had attempted to leave it out in the open, calculating that hiding it would only invite deeper suspicion from a king who noticed everything. Valerius picked up the heavy volume and moved toward the narrow stone window where the cold silver light of the moon cut through the gloom. His strong fingers turned the ancient pages. The first several dozen leaves were filled with complex genealogical charts, territorial boundaries, and the dry, administrative notations of long-dead scribes. They had recorded these lineages with meticulous care, yet the flat, overly formal language betrayed a deliberate attempt to obscure a deeper truth. On the 31st page, the nature of the record transformed. The lineage of the supreme lunar manifestation, the text read, its ink faded to a dull sepia. Officially declared extinct 3 centuries prior. Current status by spiritual probability, classified by decree of the High Sovereign Council. Valerius felt a strange, cold pull in his chest as his eyes traced the clinical descriptions that followed. The scribe had written with an unnatural flatness, trying desperately to strip all emotion from the words, which only made the hidden terror louder to those who knew how to read between the lines. The divine avatar of the moon goddess, the text explained, does not reveal its majesty at birth. It does not manifest in the superficial ways the high-ranking pacts measure worth or military dominance. It possesses no scent whatsoever, remaining completely undetectable to even the most sensitive of elder wolves. In its youth, its human form appears weak, and its wolf coat is the color of old ash, of unfinished earth, of things discarded. It projects no visible aura, registering as absolute 0 on the power scales used by the proud pack lords during the great seasonal gatherings. The king paused, his breath hitching slightly as the wind outside howled through the mountain crags. The divine bloodline suppresses itself entirely, the ancient passage continued. The power coils inward with such absolute completeness that the avatar appears entirely null. The physical body defaults to total concealment, an instinctive defense mechanism ensuring the sacred spirit has the time and protection required to survive in a hostile world before its final awakening. Valerius turned the page,
the parchment rough against his calloused skin. Signs of latent awakening include a complete lack of scent, ash-gray fur, and a nocturnal spirit emergence during the deep sleep cycles. Before the human consciousness is even aware of the divine shift, the true form will wander. Furthermore, surrounding wolves of any rank will display involuntary deference behavior. Their bodies will lower, their eyes will seek the earth, and their instincts will recognize the supreme presence long before their rational minds can comprehend it. The Alpha King stared at the words, his mind racing back to the lower corridors of his fortress just days ago. He had watched two of his most hardened battle commanders, men who had bled in 3 brutal territorial wars without ever flinching, instinctively lower their shoulders and drop their gaze as Nyx passed them in the hallway. She had been carrying a bundle of mended ledgers, her sightless eyes staring ahead, entirely unaware of the effect she had on the apex predators around her. The wolves inside his commanders had recognized her before their intellects could protest. He turned to the final leaf of the Black Book. The script here changed to a different hand, the letters larger, bolder, carved into the parchment with desperate urgency. The goddess does not announce her arrival with trumpets, the final passage warned. She simply walks among her creation as the lowest of the low. And when she finally takes her true form, the world will remember the divine laws it so proudly forgot. Valerius closed the heavy volume with a dull thud. He stood by the window for a long time, staring down at the sprawling valley below Varenhold. The distant lights of villages twinkled in the vast darkness, ordinary people living ordinary lives under a sky they did not truly understand. His hands remained perfectly steady on the windowsill, but his mind was a storm of conflicting thoughts. He thought of the pragmatic Elder Crow, who had coldly dragged the helpless. Alpha King, a romantic werewolf, just to secure coin for the impoverished Ashvin pack. He thought of the cruel Lord Vane, whose sharp features and coin-colored eyes had gleamed with malice when he offered a single copper coin to humiliate the scentless girl on the auction block. And then he remembered the golden moonstone he had bid, a prize of immense value, driven by a sudden, irresistible pull that he had rationalized as mere strategy. Now he was no longer certain of his own motives. The historical puzzle pieces began to lock into place. The supreme lineage had not naturally faded from the world. 300 years ago, Alpha King, a romantic werewolf, a corrupt coalition of proud, wealthy pack lords, had identified the divine bloodline as an existential threat to the strict caste system they had built. They could not control a power that existed outside of physical scent and military hierarchy, a power that commanded absolute devotion without ever performing for it. They had executed a systematic purge, hunting down every bloodline connected to the goddess, calling it a territorial reorganization. Valerius recalled the ancient suppressed footnotes of that bloody campaign. The ancestral name of Vane was the third signature on the execution decree. Leaving the ledger exactly where he found it, Valerius slipped back into the dark corridor. He walked toward the eastern wing of the fortress where Nyx was housed. She had no idea what was waking up inside her body. She was currently walking through his halls, quietly fixing his broken supply chains and tending to the servants. completely unaware that the most powerful men in the kingdom would butcher her the moment they discovered her identity. Vane had already sent a formal missive sealed in ominous red wax, promising to take back what belonged to the elite. Valerius did not intend to tell her yet. He needed to understand the full scope of the situation before he upended her reality entirely. But as he stood outside her closed door in the dead of night, hearing nothing but the crackle of a distant torch, he knew he had to keep her close. Meanwhile, on the other side of that thick wooden door, Nyx sat in the deep shadows of her chamber. She had told no one about the strange phenomena that had begun to govern her nights. Every morning before dawn, she woke to a profound, radiating heat rising from the stone floor beside her bed. As if a massive, protective wolf had been lying there in the darkness, only to vanish before she opened her sightless eyes. She had told no one about the single strand of fur she had discovered on her windowsill on the fourth morning of her stay. It was pure white, longer than her hand, and softer than silk. She had spent hours running it through her fingers in the early light before hiding it at the very bottom of her meager traveling bundle. Beneath the threadbare clothes she had brought from the outskirts, most unsettling of all was her relationship with the water basin. Though her eyes could not see the material world, there were fleeting moments right after waking when a strange internal vision took hold. A breath between one heartbeat and the next, where she could sense her own reflection in the still water. In those brief seconds, the face looking back at her possessed eyes that caught the light with a pale silver-white luminescence. It was a holy, terrifying glow that disappeared as soon as she tried to focus on it. She had begun covering the basin with a heavy cloth at night. She was not afraid, which was the most terrifying part of all. Instead, she felt a slow, gathering pressure, like a massive summer storm building over a distant mountain range, inevitable, patient, and absolute. She simply kept her head down and continued her work, knowing that dwelling on things she could not change was a luxury an outcast could never afford. She kept her focus on survival, praying that her younger siblings, Lyra and Fen, were safe from the cruelty of the world. The turning point arrived on the 12th evening. Nyx was carrying the newly organized ledger books into Valerius's private study when she felt the immediate shift in the room's atmosphere. The king was seated behind his massive oak desk, his heavy leather coat discarded on the floor. As he reached out to take the documents from her hands, his breath caught in a sharp, sudden gasp. It was a momentary lapse in his otherwise flawless composure. A brief crack in the armor of a man who had spent his entire life forcing his body to hide its weakness. Nyx set the ledgers down with precise care. "Take off your shirt, my alpha," she said, her voice quiet but carrying an unnatural weight that brooked no refusal. Valerius stared at her for a long moment, his proud jaw tightening. It was the look that usually preceded a harsh command or a cold dismissal. But as he looked at her calm, sightless face, his resistance melted away. He slowly unbuttoned his linen shirt, his movements stiff and measured as he managed a severe depth of pain he had been hiding for days. The wound was jagged and deep, located just below his ribs on the left side. It had been washed, but the binding was old and soaked through with dark blood. It was a clean strike from a heavy blade, not a beast's claw. A calculated assassination attempt from a border skirmish. Someone had known exactly where the king's armor was weakest. Without waiting for his permission, Nyx gathered fresh linens, clean water, and a jar of soothing mountain herbs from the cabinet. She knelt beside his heavy chair, her movements fluid and practiced. The silence that filled the room was not the tense, awkward quiet of strangers, but a deep, understanding stillness that had become their private language over the past few weeks. As she bathed the edges of the wound, the mountain wind outside battered the stained glass windows, creating a low, mournful sound against the ancient stone. Nyx reached for the clean binding cloth, but before her fingers could touch his skin, her entire body went rigid. The room vanished from her senses. The warmth of the hearth, the smell of iron and leather, the sound of the wind, all of it receded into a vast, echoing distance. Her sightless eyes rolled back slightly, catching a brilliant, shadowless silver light that existed only in her mind. Her mouth opened, and when she spoke, her voice had dropped to a resonant, hollow frequency that vibrated through the very stones of the fortress. "The Eastern Ridge," Nyx prophesied, her words flowing with terrifying geographic precision. 3 miles past the Fenmark crossing, where the old trees give way to the low valley narrows. The enemy forces are already positioning themselves in the darkness. They will use the dawn light from the southeast to blind your scouts. 3 distinct contingents. The primary strike will descend from the north face, while the secondary ambush waits in the gorge to cut off your retreat. "How do you know this?" Valerius's voice cut through the air like struck flint, sharp, hard, and laced with absolute shock. Nyx blinked, and the blinding silver light snapped out of existence. The study rushed back into her awareness. She was still kneeling on the cold floor, the clean linens trembling slightly in her hands. Valerius was leaning forward, his intense gaze drilling into her face, his features a mask of profound alarm and sudden, terrifying realization. "I do not know," Nyx whispered, her voice returning to its soft, fragile human quality. "What did I just say?" Valerius repeated every detail of her words, his voice tight. She listened to the tactical coordinates, the troop movements, and the exact timing of the impending ambush. But she felt absolutely no connection to the information. There was only a vast, empty void where a memory should have been. "I cannot explain it, my Alpha," she said softly, looking down at her hands. "I have never seen the Eastern Ridge." I do not know how those words found my mouth. The Alpha King watched her for a tense, breathless moment. Finally, his jaw relaxed fractionally. "Finish the binding," he commanded. She obeyed, wrapping the clean cloth around his powerful torso with steady hands. Before she could even store the remaining supplies, the king had already swept out of the room, his heavy boots echoing down the corridor as he rallied his elite commanders. Nyx did not sleep that night. She sat on the edge of her small cot, listening to the distant. Around the 2nd hour after midnight, the faint thunder of galloping horses echoed through the eastern gates. A small, elite strike force moving at breakneck speed into the darkness. She lay back and stared at the dark ceiling, telling herself that staying awake would not bring answers any faster. Just before the first light of dawn broke over the peaks, the horses returned.
Nyx heard the heavy hoofbeats on the stone courtyard, but what caught her attention was the profound, heavy silence that followed their arrival. It was the unmistakable silence of battle-hardened soldiers who had witnessed something so inexplicable, so divine, that their minds could not fully process it. The next night, the king came to her door. Nyx heard his distinct heavy tread in the corridor. The footsteps stopped right outside her room, followed by the soft sound of weight shifting against the stone. She rose from her bed, crossed the cold floor, and sat down with her back against the thick wood of the door, pulling her knees to her chest. It was the exact position she used to take outside the crumbling hut in the Ashvin pack when her young brother Fen would wake up screaming from his night terrors. And she needed to be close enough to offer comfort without invading his space. Valerius's voice traveled through the heavy oak. It was quiet, stripped of the grand, commanding architecture he used to dominate his council rooms and intimidate his subjects. "I do not comprehend what you are, Nyx," the king said into the empty hallway, his voice thick with uncharacteristic vulnerability. "But I know with absolute certainty that you are not the worthless outcast they claimed you were. And whatever sacred burden you carry, I swear by the old gods that I will let no man use it to destroy you." The corridor fell completely silent after that. On the other side of the door, Nyx pressed her trembling fingers against her lips as hot tears finally spilled from her sightless eyes. They were not the bitter tears of sorrow or pain she had cried for years in the slums of the Ashvin territory. This was something entirely different, a profound release, like a heavy stone being rolled away from a tomb. For her entire life, she had been valued only for her utility, treated as a broken tool to be traded for copper or forced into labor. To hear the most powerful alpha in the land declare her worth, not for what she could provide, but for what she inherently was, addressed to a closed door in the middle of the night, shook her to the absolute core. She made no sound, but she stayed pressed against the wood, knowing that the man who held the fate of 7 kingdoms in his hands was doing the exact same thing on the other side. But within the court of wolves, secrets are a volatile currency. Scent and instinct make information feel physical, something that can be smelled shifting in the cold air long before it is spoken aloud. By the 3rd morning after the successful counter-ambush at the eastern ridge, the whispers had already poisoned the entire fortress. When Nyx descended to the lower halls to assist with the morning duties, she could feel the immediate change. The soft rustle of clothing as people turned away, the heavy, suspicious glances tracking her every movement, and the abrupt, chilling silence that fell over groups of servants and warriors as she walked past. She took her meager ration of bread, sat in her usual corner, and ate with deliberate calmness, refusing to let her hands shake. Lord Vane had not openly declared himself the source of the rumors. The cruel nobleman was far too intelligent for such crude tactics. He understood that the most devastating damage is always done indirectly, by planting a poisonous seed in the right ears and letting the natural paranoia of the pack hierarchy do the rest. By the time the High Council convened in formal session, the lie had taken a terrifying, elegant shape. The blind girl, Vane's agents whispered through the halls, was a dangerous plant. A practitioner of forbidden, dark moon magic placed deliberately within the king's inner circle to manipulate his mind. The lunar auction had been an orchestrated performance to garner sympathy, and her lack of scent was proof of a cursed, unnatural state. The tactical information she had provided regarding the Eastern Ridge was not a divine prophecy, but treasonous coordination. She had known exactly where Vane's rogue forces were positioned because she was secretly working with them to undermine the kingdom's military strength. It was a masterful piece of deception, transforming her greatest act of salvation into the primary evidence of her treason. Half of the High Council believed the lie instantly, driven by their deep-seated fear of anything that disrupted the traditional hierarchy. The other half was paralyzed by doubt, which, in a room of rulers, amounted to the exact same thing. Valerius sat at the head of the long stone table, his face a mask of absolute granite as he listened to his lords demand execution. He looked at Vane, who sat with a smug, self-assured smile, his coin-colored eyes gleaming with triumph. The king thought of the quiet hallway at midnight, of the blind girl weeping silently behind a wooden door, asking for absolutely nothing while the world conspired to tear her apart. He thought of the black ledger hidden in the archives, and the proud lords who would gladly murder a goddess just to maintain their petty titles. "We demand a trial of scent," the senior council lord declared, striking his fist against the table. "It is the ancient, unalterable right of this court to smell the truth within an accused soul. She cannot refuse it, my alpha." Valerius had the absolute authority to deny the request. He could have dismissed the council and shielded her with his royal guard. But he knew what a refusal would look like to the proud wolf packs. It would look like confirmation of her guilt, a confession that the king was protecting a traitor because he had been bewitched. It would paint a target on her back that no army could protect her from. "Schedule the trial for tonight," Valerius commanded, his voice cold enough to freeze water. The Hall of Moons was packed to the absolute limits when the hour arrived. The space felt entirely different than it had during the slave auction. The market atmosphere was gone, replaced by a suffocating, bloodthirsty tension. The 40-foot stone walls curved inward like a massive rib cage, and the stone constellations painted across the ceiling seemed to look down with cold judgment. Nyx stood at the absolute center of the hall on a raised circular platform of pale, polished marble. She wore her simple, rough gray wool tunic and her dark cloak, her hands resting peacefully at her sides. Though her sightless eyes could not see the hundreds of hostile faces staring down at her, she held her head high. Focusing her internal gaze on a fixed, invisible point just beneath the painted stars, Valerius watched her from the elevated royal dais, his heart tightening. She was using the exact same defense mechanism she had used on the auction block, holding her fragile human form together through sheer, unyielding spiritual resilience. The royal scent reader stepped forward from the shadows. She was an ancient, frail wolf whose eyes had gone completely milky white with age, earning her the name of the Blind Seer. She had served the royal bloodline for over 40 decades, sniffing out traitors, murderers, and liars without a single mistake. Her face had remained completely expressionless during the executions of the most powerful lords in history. She approached her task like water flowing into a dark crevice, quiet, unhurried, and absolute. The old woman stepped onto the marble platform, her long claw-like fingers extending toward the blind girl. The entire hall held its collective breath. The silence was so absolute that the crackle of the great iron cauldrons sounded like thunder. The seer raised her trembling hands and placed them firmly against Nyx's temples. Her thumbs rested gently on the hinge of the girl's jaw, her fingertips curling into the ash-gray hair near her crown. The ancient wolf closed her milky eyes, tilting her head back as she prepared to inhale the spiritual essence of the accused. 10 seconds passed in agonizing silence. 20 seconds. Then the old seer's face completely shattered. The transformation was terrifying. The absolute composure she had maintained for 40 years vanished in a single breathless instant. The color completely drained from her wrinkled skin, leaving her the color of old ash. Her shoulders hitched violently, and her hands, which had remained steady through a lifetime of horrors, went completely rigid against Nyx's head. She did not step back. She recoiled, tearing her hands away from the blind girl as if she had touched white-hot iron. The old woman stumbled backward, her breath coming in ragged, terrified gasps, her milky eyes wide with an absolute, primordial terror that no mortal wolf had ever seen before. She did not face the court, nor did she address the shouting lords who were demanding a verdict. Instead, she turned her trembling body entirely toward the royal dais, looking directly at Valerius. She practically dragged herself across the stone floor, collapsing against the edge of the king's table. She leaned forward, her voice a desperate, frantic whisper that reached only the Alpha King's ears. "That is no witch, my Alpha," the seer choked out, her entire body shaking with a violent tremor. "There is no darkness in her. There is no scent, because there is no mortal soul within that vessel. My hands touched an abyss of pure, shadowless light. It is the architect of the stars. It is the mother of the wolves. You have put the moon goddess herself on trial." Valerius went entirely still, the blood turning to ice in his veins as the words of the ancient ledger echoed in his mind. The old seer straightened herself with the last remnants of her strength, turning her frail body to face the restless, bloodthirsty court. When she spoke, her voice carried a bizarre, supernatural frequency that cut through the roaring crowd like a silver blade, silencing every lord in the room. "This wolf carries no treason," the seer proclaimed, her hands shaking as she pointed toward the blind girl in gray wool. "She carries a pause." The entire hall stirred in confusion, but the old woman raised her arm, her voice rising to a final, desperate warning. The pause of a supreme creator, deciding whether to bless this kingdom or erase it from the face of the earth. The grand ballroom of the Royal Solstice Ball was a masterclass in architectural arrogance, a sprawling monument to the absolute power of the high-ranking bloodlines. Every surface of the colossal hall had been polished to a mirrored gleam, reflecting the sharp, cold light of 1,000 wax candles nestled within heavy iron chandeliers. Long banquet tables, draped in deep midnight blue cloth and embroidered with the silver crest of the 7 territories, groaned under the weight of roasted meats and heavy winter wines. 500 elite wolves filled the space,
their presence creating a thick, suffocating cloud of amber, cedar, and dark musk.
It was the scent of ancient authority, a collective gathering of predators dressing up their savagery in silks and fine-tailored wool.
Valerius, the proud alpha king of the 7 territories, stood at the apex of the royal dais. His imposing, unhurried presence commanded the room without him needing to utter a single word. He was a ruler who had built his empire on the ironclad logic of military dominance, secure borders, and the preservation of pure, unblemished bloodlines. Yet, as he looked down at the glittering court, his dark eyes kept drifting toward the eastern wall. Drawn by a magnetic pull he refused to acknowledge. Standing completely isolated near the heavy tapestries was Nyx. She had been given a simple, deep gray dress for the evening, a garment that did nothing to hide her lack of status. She was the blind, scentless wolf whom the Ashvin pack had discarded, an outcast whose very existence seemed an affront to the proud nobles surrounding her. For weeks she had endured the whispers, the mocking glances, and the cold isolation of the royal fortress, holding on to her quiet resilience solely to ensure that her younger sister Lyra and her brother Fen were kept safe from the starvation of the outskirts. She stood with her hands folded at her sides, her face composed, presenting an image of absolute stillness in the center of a room that actively despised her. Vane, the cruel and wealthy silver-tongued nobleman, moved from his faction of lords with the predatory grace of a man who had detected a vulnerability. His formal silver-gray attire caught the candlelight as he crossed the polished floor, his coin-colored eyes locked onto the blind girl. The collective animal awareness of 500 predators registered his movement. Conversations folded, heads turned, and a tense, expectant silence rippled through the ballroom. Stopping directly in front of Nyx, Vane let out a sharp, mocking laugh that carried across the quieted hall. "Let them see what the kingdom is harboring," Vane announced, his voice dripping with malice. "Let everyone witness the absolute nothingness that has crawled into our midwinter feast." With a sudden, violent movement of both hands, he grabbed Nyx's heavy woolen cloak and tore it away from her shoulders. The music died instantly. The room held its breath. Nyx stood exposed under the glare of 1,000 candles, her ash-gray form revealed to the entire court. There was no shimmering aura, no intoxicating scent of a high-ranking Omega, no visible power to command respect. She was everything the kingdom had trained itself to despise and dismiss, standing stripped of her protection before a sea of staring wolves. Vane sneered, turning toward the royal dais to lock eyes with the king, expecting the ruler to join in the public humiliation of a low-born slave. Valerius looked down from his throne, his jaw clenched so tightly the muscle leaped beneath his skin. Within his chest, his inner wolf roared, recognizing a profound, ancient bond with the blind girl standing in the center of the hall. Every instinct commanded him to step down, to tear Vane apart, and to claim Nyx before the entire assembly. But Valerius was a king consumed by his own pride. He looked at the powerful lords watching him, remembered the strategic military alliances he needed to secure, and chose his kingdom over the phantom pull in his blood. He could not permit a blind, scentless outcast to sit beside him as the Luna of 7 territories.
Hardening his expression, Valerius rose to his full height. His voice broke over the silent room like a thunderclap, devoid of mercy. "This court has no place for weakness," the Alpha King declared, his words cementing his decision. "A king requires a lineage of strength, not the broken remnants of a low-ranked pack. I reject any bond that threatens the power of this throne. You are dismissed from my sight." The rejection was absolute. Vane smiled in triumph, and a murmur of approval rippled through the assembly of noble wolves. Nyx did not flinch, nor did she cry out in defense of herself. Instead, she stood perfectly still as the words washed over her, a deep, sorrowful recognition settling into her sightless eyes. She did not look at Valerius, but a single luminous tear escaped her eyelids, tracing a slow path down her ash-colored cheek before falling toward the floor. The moment that tear struck the cold white stone, the temperature in the ballroom plummeted. The flames of the 1,000 candles turned a piercing, brilliant silver, casting long, unnatural shadows against the walls. A sudden supernatural frequency cut through the hall, a sound like a silver blade slicing through the wind. Nyx turned away from the royal dais, her movements losing every trace of human fragility. As she walked toward the great iron doors, her steps carried the weight of an ancient creator. A supreme deity who had walked among her creation in disguise to test their capacity for mercy, only to find them utterly wanting. She vanished into the dark, howling winter night without looking back. The punishment was instantaneous. Before the heavy doors could even slam shut, a searing, agonizing heat ripped through Valerius's chest. He collapsed against the royal table, gripping his torso as if his ribs were cracking apart. Across the ballroom, the horrific sound of 500 alphas screaming in agony echoed off the stone walls. Pack lords, proud commanders, elite soldiers, and noble warriors dropped to their knees, clutching their throats as their bodies convulsed. Valerius gasped for air, trying to reach deep within his spirit to summon his royal wolf, to feel the familiar. The comforting surge of primal muscle and wild fury that had defined his entire life. But there was nothing. The internal connection was gone, violently severed by a cosmic force. The alphas looked at their trembling hands, realizing in utter horror that their beasts had been stripped away. The ability to shift, the very foundation of their supremacy, had been erased from their bloodlines. The supreme deity had wept, and in her departure she had taken her blessing with her. Weeks stretched into a nightmare of vulnerability and despair. Without their wolves, the proud rulers of the 7 territories were reduced to fragile, ordinary men, terrified of the external threats lurking beyond their borders. The grand architecture of Varenhold felt less like a stronghold and more like a tomb. Elder Crow and the remaining pack leaders spent their days frantically unsealing the ancient, forbidden ledgers in the deepest vaults, searching for a cure to the divine affliction. When the truth was finally uncovered, the revelation shattered what little pride Valerius had left. The ancient texts, written 3 centuries ago during the first dawning of the kingdom, described the moon goddess descending to the mortal realm in the guise of a scentless, sightless wolf to judge the hearts of those who ruled in her name. The girl they had mocked, the Omega Valerius had publicly rejected for the sake of his military alliances, was the supreme creator herself. As the night of the full moon approached, the atmosphere in the kingdom grew desperate. The fields withered, the winter winds howled with a vengeful fury, and the people realized that without the goddess's forgiveness, the entire race of wolves would face absolute extinction. Valerius, stripped of his arrogance and broken by the weight of his monumental error, knew there was only one action left to take. He cast aside his royal robes, left his crown on the empty throne, and departed from the fortress alone. He traveled for days through the biting cold, journeying past the borders of the 7 territories to the desolate, mist-shrouded expanses known as the Forgotten Lands. It was a place where the physical world frayed into the spiritual realm, a landscape of jagged black stone and freezing mud where no mortal pack dared to tread. His body, now merely human and susceptible to the elements, bruised and bled against the harsh terrain. His boots tore, his hands grew numb, but he kept moving, driven by an agonizing repentance that burned hotter than any fever. When his legs could no longer support him, the king dropped to his hands and knees, literally crawling through the dirt, discarding every ounce of the royal pride that had ruined his kingdom. At the center of the desolate valley, beneath the cold, unyielding light of the full moon, he found her. Nyx was no longer dressed in the ruined gray wool of a servant. She stood atop a dais of natural stone, surrounded by a swirling aura of starlight and winter air. Her form was magnificent, radiating a cosmic, breathtaking divinity that made the surrounding mountains seem small and insignificant. Her silver eyes, though sightless to the mortal world, held the entire universe within their depth, burning with a brilliant, steady celestial light. Valerius dragged himself to the base of the stone, collapsing entirely into the freezing mud at her feet. He pressed his forehead against the earth, his body shaking with exhaustion and profound regret. The absolute solitude of his position, a king brought to the dirt by the unanimous vote of his own failures, was absolute. "Forgive me, your majesty," Valerius choked out, his voice fracturing into the silent, frozen air. "I was blind to the truth. I threw away the greatest blessing this world has ever known for the sake of an empty throne. Please, have mercy on my people." Nyx looked down at the broken man kneeling in the mire. She did not growl, nor did she display the petty anger of a mortal ruler. She stepped down from the stone dais, her bare feet making no sound against the frozen ground, and stopped directly before him. She reached out, her pale, luminous fingers gently brushing through the king's dark, matted hair. For a fleeting second, Valerius felt a spark of hope, a desperate belief that his submission might restore the warmth to his kingdom. But her touch remained as cold as the winter stars. When she spoke, her voice carried a freezing, supernatural frequency that echoed through his very soul, sealing his fate with absolute finality. "Your pride is the price to pay, my Alpha," Nyx whispered, her words cutting through the dark night like ice. And in the heavy, unbroken silence of the Forgotten Lands, the king remained on his knees in the dirt, finally understanding that some choices, once made under the gaze of the heavens, can never be undone. Part 4. The Final Reckoning of the Moon Goddess.
The devastating silence of the Forgotten Lands stretched across the 7 territories like a heavy shroud.
On the frozen earth, Alpha King Valerius remained on his knees, his forehead pressed against the dirt. The majestic power that had once defined his lineage was completely gone. His body was trapped in its human shell, heavy and trembling with a deep, chilling exhaustion. Above him stood Nyx, no longer the blind, scentless outcast he had discarded. She was the supreme deity manifested in flesh, her ash-gray form radiating an ethereal, terrifying luminescence. Beside her, the great celestial spirit wolf, the true form that had been mocked at the lunar auction, stood fully revealed. Its paws did not touch the grass. Instead, they hovered upon beams of pure moonlight. The divine beast looked down at the ruined ruler with the absolute calm of a creator who had witnessed the rise and fall of countless empires. "Look upon what your pride has built, Valerius," Nyx spoke, her voice carrying the crushing weight of a collapsing mountain. The supernatural frequency echoed through the minds of every wolf across the borders, from the highest stone towers of Varenhold to the damp, impoverished huts of the Ashvenpack outskirts, where Lyra and Fen lay shivering. Her words resonated with terrifying clarity. You measured the value of your people by bloodlines, by aggressive scents, and by the cruel hierarchies of your armies. You permitted the vulnerable to be sold like livestock for copper coins. Now your accounting is due. Valerius swallowed hard, the taste of ash and failure bitter on his tongue. He looked up at her, his eyes hollowed by grief. "My Luna, your Majesty," he choked out, his voice a broken rasp against the howling wind. "Take my life. Let my blood wash away the curse. But I beg of you, restore. Do not let the kingdom perish in total darkness." Nyx looked past him, her blind, radiant eyes gazing toward the vast valleys. Far below, the flickering torches of the settlements looked like dying sparks. She thought of Fen, her 12-year-old brother, who had spent his life waking up from night terrors in a drafty cabin. Told by the elders that his frail bones made him worthless. She thought of 9-year-old Lyra, tracing letters in the dirt, dreaming of a future that the cruel laws of the Alpha King would have never allowed her to have. She had endured the mocking laughter of Lord Vane at the auction block, standing tall with a trembling heart, all to ensure those children could survive. A kingdom that thrives on the subjugation of the weak does not deserve to stand, Nyx stated coldly. "I will change it," Valerius vowed, tears finally cutting tracks through the mud on his face. He bared his neck in ultimate submission, a true posture of defeat before his supreme deity. "I swear it upon the ancient stones. If you grant us mercy, no wolf will ever be auctioned again. The strong will protect the vulnerable, not exploit them. I will dismantle the laws myself. I obey your will, my queen." The massive full moon directly above them began to shift. The icy, blinding white glow softened, bleeding into a deep, burning gold, the color of the mythical era when the first wolves pledged their souls to the heavens. The suffocating pressure in the air cracked. Nyx raised her hand, and the luminous spirit wolf stepped forward, exhaling a warm, golden mist that swept across the entire continent. In an instant, a collective roar echoed from the distant forests. The curse was lifted. The wolves had regained their spirits, but the lesson was permanently etched into their souls. The moon goddess turned her back on the weeping king, stepping into the golden light. Her voice lingered in the wind, a final, unyielding decree for the new era. Rise, Valerius. Go back to your throne, but remember this day. Your crown no longer belongs to your bloodline. It belongs to the quiet souls who survived your cruelty. Govern with mercy, or the heavens will finish what was started tonight. A note to our listeners. True majesty cannot be bought, and the ultimate power in any realm does not belong to the tyrant with an army. It belongs to the quiet survivor who decides it is time to rewrite the world. If Nyx's journey from the auction block to the divine throne moved you, subscribe now and turn on notifications. The era of the moon goddess has just begun.